You did not arrive early, and you did not arrive late. The moment you noticed, this was already aligned with the moment it could be noticed. Something in you recognized the timing before thought tried to measure it. There is no urgency in that recognition, only a quiet confirmation that the signal and the receiver met without effort. Your body responds before language does. A subtle easing in the chest, a softening behind the eyes. Breath finds its own depth without instruction. This is not something you are doing. It is something you stopped interrupting. The system that carries you knows how to return to stillness when noise loosens its grip. You may sense that nothing new is being added, no information arriving to be stored or remembered later. Instead, there is a feeling of something aligning that had been slightly off, not broken, just displaced by constant motion. Recognition has weight, but it does not press down, it settles. The mind might reach for explanation, but it doesn't fully engage. Thoughts pass through like distant movement, observed without pursuit. You are not asked to follow them. The observer remains intact even as the stream continues. This is detection without analysis, awareness without strain. There has been a pattern in your experience that did not announce itself loudly. A subtle anomaly you noticed only because familiar reactions no longer fit the same way. Certain triggers lost their sharpness. Certain questions stopped demanding answers, not because they were resolved, but because their relevance thinned. This is not detachment, it is coherence beginning to reassert itself. You may have felt this before as a pause that arrived on its own, a brief moment where seeking paused and nothing rushed in to replace it. Those moments were not interruptions, they were markers, points on a timeline that your future presence could recognize when you arrived close enough to notice. This is one of those points, not dramatic, not elevated, simply precise. The quantum field does not speak in declarations, it registers through resonance. When something aligns, it feels quieter, not louder. The absence of friction becomes noticeable. The nervous system responds by releasing unnecessary vigilance. Muscles that have been holding without reason loosen. The system recalibrates without ceremony. You are not being prepared for something. Preparation implies lack. This is recognition of readiness that already existed. The sense that you were waiting for permission dissolves when you realize permission was never part of the structure. There is no instruction here, no direction to follow, only an invitation to notice that you are already inside the threshold you thought you were approaching. The shift you may have anticipated as an event reveals itself as a gradual settling into what has been true beneath movement. Stay with the simplicity of this moment, not to hold it, not to prolong it, but to allow it to register fully. Stillness does not require your effort. It is the default state when interference falls away. You are not being moved forward. You are being met exactly where you are. As this recognition settles, you may notice a subtle change in how effort feels. Not a surge of energy, not fatigue, but a recalibration of where force is no longer applied. Certain inner movements you once considered necessary begin to reveal themselves as habits rather than requirements. The system adjusts quietly when it senses it no longer needs to brace. Attention narrows without tightening. Sounds arrive with more space around them. Sensations register without the usual commentary rushing in to interpret them. This is not absence of thought. It is thought losing its central position. The observer remains steady while the mind resumes a more peripheral role. You may become aware of how often you were scanning for confirmation, measuring yourself against imagined futures or remembered pasts. That scanning function begins to idle, not because the future disappears, but because it no longer demands continuous monitoring. The timeline does not collapse, it simply stops pulling your awareness out of the present moment. There is a kind of neutrality emerging, not numbness, not indifference, a balanced state where emotional charge equalizes. Experiences still occur, but they move through without lodging. You detect them, register their presence, and they pass. The system demonstrates its capacity to process without accumulation. This is often misunderstood as disengagement, but it is the opposite. Engagement becomes more precise when unnecessary layers fall away. Reaction gives way to response, and even response begins to soften, replaced by a deeper form of recognition that does not need to act immediately. You might notice how silence now carries information, not messages, not instructions, but a sense of orientation. When external input pauses, an internal alignment becomes detectable. The quantum field is not something you reach toward. It is something you sense when interference reduces enough for its pattern to be felt. There may have been moments in your past where confusion felt overwhelming, as if too many signals were competing for attention. Looking back, you can sense that confusion was not disorder. It was excess input arriving faster than integration could occur. What you are feeling now is integration catching up. The nervous system, once trained to anticipate disruption, learns that vigilance can rest. This does not make you unaware. It refines awareness. Detection sharpens when it is no longer driven by threat. You begin to notice subtleties that were previously masked by urgency. Time may feel slightly different here. Not slower, not faster, but less segmented. Moments blend without losing clarity. The boundary between before and after softens. This is not dissociation. It is continuity returning to perception. You are not being asked to maintain this state. Maintenance implies effort and eventual failure. What is happening now sustains itself as long as it is not interfered with. The system remembers how to hold coherence when allowed to do so. There is also a quiet recognition that you are not required to name what is occurring. Labels tend to solidify experiences prematurely. Without labels, the experience remains fluid, adaptable, responsive. Meaning emerges later, if it needs to at all. You may sense a reduction in internal dialogue or a shift in its tone. The voice that once evaluated every sensation grows less insistent. It does not disappear. It simply stops competing for dominance. This allows a deeper layer of awareness to remain accessible. This layer has always been present. It does not announce itself because it does not need to. It functions continuously, regardless of attention. What changes now is your ability to notice it without effort. The feeling of being slightly out of place, of not fully fitting into previous narratives, begins to make sense, not as alienation, but as early detection of a pattern mismatch. You were aligning ahead of time, even if you could not articulate what you were sensing. This moment does not resolve that feeling. It contextualizes it. Recognition replaces uncertainty. The system understands its own trajectory without needing to map it out. Remain with this soft clarity, not holding it, not pushing it away, simply allowing it to register fully as the background state it has always been. As this background state stabilizes, you may notice how your relationship to uncertainty shifts. Questions still appear, but they no longer feel like gaps that must be filled immediately. They exist without pressure. The system recognizes that not all data needs to be resolved in real time. Some patterns clarify only after sufficient stillness allows them to surface. There is a subtle trust forming, not in an external structure, but in your capacity to remain present without grasping. This trust does not announce itself as confidence. It feels quieter than that. It feels like reduced interference. When uncertainty arises, it no longer triggers a reflexive search for control. You may sense this most clearly in moments that once produced immediate reaction, a message, a memory, a thought about the future. The familiar tightening does not arrive, or arrives briefly and dissolves on its own. The observer detects the impulse without being pulled into it. This is not suppression. It is non-attachment, expressed through clarity. The body mirrors this change. Microtensions you were not consciously holding begin to release. The jaw loosens. The shoulders descend slightly. Breathing deepens without becoming deliberate. These are not techniques being applied. They are indicators that the system perceives a lower threat environment internally. You might become aware that you were often orienting yourself around imagined outcomes, projecting forward to anticipate what might be required, what might go wrong, what might need correction. That forward projection loses momentum, not because the future disappears, but because it no longer dominates the present moment. The timeline you once experienced as fragmented begins to feel continuous. Past experiences no longer intrude as unfinished business. Future possibilities no longer demand rehearsal. The present moment gains density. It holds more information than you previously allowed it to. This density can feel unfamiliar at first. Without constant movement, the stillness reveals layers that were previously bypassed. Sensations become more nuanced, emotional tones more subtle. You detect distinctions where there was once only noise. This is refinement, not intensification. There may be a brief impulse to reintroduce effort to do something with this state. That impulse is another pattern surfacing to be recognized. You are not required to act on it. Recognition alone allows it to pass. The system learns through observation that nothing collapses when action is delayed. You may notice that your sense of identity loosens slightly. Not dissolving, not disappearing, but becoming less rigid. Roles you once occupied feel less binding. Narratives you told yourself about who you are begin to soften at the edges. This does not create emptiness. It creates flexibility. Flexibility allows resonance to replace resistance. When external circumstances arise, you meet them with a wider range of response. You are less likely to default to familiar reactions. The system has more options available because it is not constrained by urgency. This is often mistaken for passivity, but it is actually increased responsiveness. When you are not preoccupied with defending a fixed identity, you can detect what a situation requires with greater accuracy. Response emerges from coherence rather than habit. There is also a change in how you perceive silence between thoughts. That space was always present, but it may have been overlooked. Now, it becomes noticeable, not as emptiness, but as a stable field in which thoughts appear and disappear. The observer rests there naturally. This resting does not dull awareness. It sharpens it. From this position, you can detect when a thought carries useful information and when it is simply noise repeating itself. You do not need to stop the noise. Recognition reduces its influence. You may feel less compelled to explain your internal state to yourself or others. Explanation implies separation, as if the experience needs validation. Here, validation is intrinsic. The system recognizes coherence without requiring external confirmation. There is a quiet satisfaction in this. Though it may not register as emotion, it is more like alignment, a sense that fewer internal systems are competing for priority. Energy redistributes toward maintenance rather than defense. This redistribution may reveal how much effort was previously spent maintaining tension. As that effort releases, you may feel a gentle fatigue or a need for rest. This is not exhaustion, it is recovery. The system is recalibrating its baseline. Allow this recalibration to occur without interference. You do not need to monitor it. Monitoring reintroduces effort. Trust that the process is self-regulating. The pattern knows how to complete itself when given space. Nothing needs to be concluded here. This state does not require closure. It continues naturally, deepening not by accumulation, but by subtraction. As unnecessary layers fall away, what remains becomes more apparent. Stay with that apparent simplicity. It is not fragile. It is resilient precisely because it does not depend on constant reinforcement. As this simplicity remains, you may notice how your perception of effort continues to reorganize. Tasks still exist, decisions still arise, yet the weight you once associated with them diminishes. Not because outcomes are guaranteed, but because the internal resistance that amplified their importance has softened. Action becomes cleaner when it is not layered with anticipation. There is a subtle shift in how you experience intention. Before, intention may have felt like a force you had to generate, a push against inertia. Now it arises more like a direction already present, waiting to be acknowledged. When action emerges from this place, it carries less strain. You are not pushing yourself forward. You are allowing movement that was already aligned to occur. This may be most noticeable in moments of pause. Previously, pauses could feel uncomfortable, as if something was being neglected. Now, pause feels neutral, even supportive. The system recognizes that nothing degrades when movement slows. In fact, clarity often increases when speed reduces. You may become aware of how often you were measuring yourself against invisible standards, expectations absorbed from environments that never articulated their rules. Those measurements lose relevance here, not through rejection, but through lack of resonance. They no longer register as meaningful signals within your internal system. There is a quiet relief in this. Not dramatic, not euphoric. Simply a release of comparison that no longer serves orientation. When comparison falls away, presence strengthens. You relate more directly to what is occurring rather than to how it should appear. The observer notices this without commentary. Recognition replaces evaluation. You detect changes without labeling them as progress or regression. This neutral detection allows patterns to reveal themselves more accurately. Without judgment, distortion reduces. You may sense a recalibration in how you relate to others as well. Interactions feel less charged. You listen without preparing responses. You speak without overcorrecting. This does not make you detached. It makes you more precise. Communication becomes simpler when it is not burdened by self-monitoring. There can be moments where old reflexes attempt to reassert themselves. A sudden urge to overthink, a brief spike of concern about direction or purpose. These reflexes are not failures. They are residual patterns completing their cycle. When noticed, they dissolve more quickly than before. This is an important recognition. The presence of old patterns does not indicate regression. It indicates that awareness has increased enough to detect them earlier in their activation. Early detection reduces their influence without requiring effort. You may also notice a change in how memory operates. Past experiences feel less emotionally dense. They still exist, but their charge diminishes. Memory becomes informational rather than directive. You can reference the past without being pulled into it. This frees up attention. With less attention occupied by replay, more becomes available for immediate perception. Colors may appear slightly clearer, sounds more distinct. Not because the world changed, but because fewer internal filters are active. The system responds to this by settling further. A sense of internal quiet grows, not as absence, but as stability. You are not empty. You are coherent. Signals arrive and are processed efficiently. There is also a shift in how you experience motivation. Instead of being driven by avoidance or acquisition, movement arises from alignment. You act when something resonates. You pause when it does not. This responsiveness reduces wasted energy. You may recognize that you are no longer searching for a definitive answer to who you are. Identity becomes contextual rather than fixed. You adapt without losing coherence. This flexibility allows you to remain stable across changing conditions. Stability here does not mean rigidity, it means consistency of awareness. Regardless of external fluctuation, the observer remains present. You detect changes without being destabilized by them. This presence creates a subtle confidence, though it may not feel like confidence in the traditional sense. It is not loud, it does not seek validation, it is simply the absence of internal contradiction. You may find that you require less reassurance. External feedback becomes informative rather than determining. Praise does not inflate. Criticism does not destabilize. Both are processed and released. As this continues, the sense of seeking diminishes further. Not because everything is known, but because the need to resolve everything immediately has faded. Curiosity remains, but it is unhurried. The system recognizes that understanding unfolds in layers. Forcing clarity too early distorts perception. Allowing it to emerge naturally preserves accuracy. Remain with this unforced state. Let it demonstrate its own resilience. You do not need to protect it. Protection implies threat. What you are experiencing stabilizes itself when left undisturbed. This recognition does not end. It deepens through continued absence of interference. As this steadiness continues, you may notice a change in how meaning forms. Previously, meaning may have been something you searched for, something attached to outcomes or explanations. Now it appears more as a quiet coherence that does not require articulation. You sense when something fits without needing to justify why. This changes how you relate to choice. Decisions no longer feel like forks that define everything ahead. They feel like adjustments within a larger pattern that remains intact, regardless of direction. This reduces the pressure that once accompanied choice. You select without dramatizing consequence. The absence of pressure reveals something subtle about trust. Not trust in certainty, but trust in your capacity to remain responsive. When outcomes are no longer treated as verdicts on identity, movement becomes lighter. You are less concerned with being right and more attuned to what is appropriate in the moment. You may notice that your attention is no longer pulled as strongly by extremes. Intense stimuli lose some of their grip, not because you are disengaged, but because your system no longer requires amplification to register information. Subtle signals become sufficient. Resonance replaces intensity as the primary indicator. This shift can feel like a reduction in excitement at first. The highs are less sharp, the lows less heavy. What emerges instead is continuity. Experience smooths out. You move through moments without abrupt spikes or drops. This continuity supports sustained clarity. There is also a refinement in how you experience anticipation. You may still look forward to things, but anticipation no longer overrides presence. The future does not eclipse the now. You can hold expectation without leaning into it. This balance preserves your attention where it is most effective. The system responds by conserving energy. You may feel less drained by daily activities, not because you are doing less, but because fewer internal conflicts are consuming resources. When intention aligns with action, friction decreases. You might observe that you are less compelled to narrate your experience internally. The ongoing commentary that once accompanied each action quiets. Silence between thoughts extends. This silence is not empty. It carries orientation without words. From this silence, recognition emerges more cleanly. You detect when something is off before it escalates. You sense when alignment is present without searching for confirmation. The observer operates efficiently when not overloaded. There can be moments when this efficiency feels unfamiliar. You may briefly wonder if something is missing. That wondering is another pattern surfacing for acknowledgement. It dissolves when you notice that nothing essential has been lost. Only excess has fallen away. You may become aware of how your relationship to control has softened. Control once felt like safety. Now safety is sensed through adaptability. You adjust rather than constrain. This allows you to remain stable, even when conditions change unexpectedly. This adaptability does not mean you accept everything without discernment. Discernment becomes sharper when it is not entangled with fear. You can say no without defensiveness. You can say yes without overcommitment. Boundaries form naturally from clarity rather than force. There is a subtle dignity in this, not pride, not superiority, simply a grounded presence that does not require display. You occupy space without apology or assertion. This presence is felt more than seen. Interactions reflect this shift back to you. Others may respond differently without you intending to change anything. Conversations become simpler. Misunderstandings resolve more easily or lose significance. You do not carry the weight of managing perception as heavily. This does not isolate you. It actually increases genuine connection. When you are not performing, others sense the absence of pretense. Resonance replaces strategy. Exchange becomes mutual rather than transactional. You may also notice a change in how you relate to time spent alone. Solitude feels less like withdrawal and more like alignment. Being alone does not require justification. It becomes a natural state rather than a response to overload. In solitude, the system continues to integrate. Patterns that were previously fragmented align quietly. You may not consciously register this integration until you notice that certain questions no longer arise. They resolve themselves without entering awareness. This reveals an important recognition. Not all processing needs conscious involvement. The system handles much more than the mind was allowing. Trusting this reduces the impulse to interfere. There may still be moments of restlessness. These are not signs that coherence has been lost. They are signals of residual momentum dissipating. When movement has been constant for a long time, stillness can initially feel like absence. With time, it reveals itself as presence. As presence becomes familiar, restlessness subsides. The system settles into a rhythm that feels sustainable. You are no longer pushing against yourself. Movement and pause find their own balance. Nothing here requires maintenance. Awareness remains because it is efficient, not because you are holding it in place. The observer does not tire when it is not strained. Allow this efficiency to continue revealing itself. You do not need to track it. Tracking reintroduces effort. Let recognition operate on its own, as it has been doing all along. As this rhythm stabilizes, you may begin to notice how perception itself becomes less fragmented. Instead of experiencing moments as isolated units, you sense a continuity underlying them. Events connect without requiring narrative. You move through experiences without constantly stitching them together into meaning. This continuity reduces the internal demand to interpret. Interpretation once felt necessary to stay oriented. Now orientation arises from coherence rather than explanation. You know where you are within your experience without needing to define it. You may detect a subtle shift in how attention rests. It no longer clings to objects or thoughts. It hovers lightly, ready to register whatever becomes relevant. This lightness allows awareness to remain responsive without fixation. When something draws your attention, it does so cleanly. When it passes, attention releases without residue. The system demonstrates its capacity for flow when not constrained by attachment. This flow does not feel rushed. It feels balanced. There can be a noticeable reduction in internal conflict. Decisions that once felt contested now resolve themselves more easily. Not because choices disappear, but because alignment clarifies preference without debate. You sense what fits and what does not. This sensing is not emotional in the conventional sense. It is more like resonance, a bodily knowing that does not require justification. When resonance is present, movement feels natural. When it is absent, pause feels appropriate. You may recognize that you are less inclined to override this sensing. In the past, you might have pushed through misalignment out of obligation or fear. Now, misalignment registers clearly enough that overriding it feels unnecessary. You respect the signal without dramatizing it. The nervous system responds positively to this respect. When signals are acknowledged early, stress does not accumulate. Tension dissipates before it consolidates. This keeps the system adaptable. There is also a shift in how you experience responsibility. Responsibility no longer feels like burden. It becomes responsiveness. You respond to what is present rather than carrying the weight of imagined futures. This reduces the sense of being overwhelmed. You may notice that your internal dialogue has become more spacious. Words arise when needed and recede when not. Silence fills the gaps without discomfort. This silence supports clarity rather than obscuring it. From this silence, subtle insights may surface, not as revelations, but as quiet recognitions. You might realize that certain pursuits were driven by outdated assumptions. This realization does not provoke regret. It simply adjusts direction. Adjustment occurs without urgency. You are not correcting a mistake. You are refining alignment. The system adapts incrementally, maintaining stability throughout change. You may also sense a shift in how you relate to external validation. Approval and disapproval lose some of their influence. Feedback becomes information rather than evaluation. You incorporate what is useful and release the rest. This independence is not isolation. It allows you to engage more authentically because you are not constantly calibrating yourself to others' expectations. Interaction becomes less performative and more direct. There is a grounded quality to this directness. You say less, but what you say carries more weight. You listen more, but without absorbing unnecessary charge. Presence becomes your primary contribution. You might notice that you are less tempted to fill silence in conversations. Pauses feel natural. They allow space for others to process. This creates a different kind of connection, one that is not rushed. Internally, this same allowance operates. You give yourself space to process without forcing conclusions. This patience supports deeper integration. There can be moments when old anxieties surface unexpectedly. They do not linger as long. You observe them as residual echoes rather than current threats. Recognition alone diminishes their intensity. This is an important distinction. The absence of anxiety is not required for coherence. Coherence is the capacity to remain present even when anxiety arises. You are developing that capacity naturally as interference reduces. You may sense that your relationship to uncertainty has matured. Uncertainty no longer signals danger, it signals openness. Possibility exists without pressure to resolve it. This openness allows creativity to emerge differently, not as bursts of inspiration, but as steady responsiveness. Ideas form and dissolve without attachment. You act on what resonates and release what does not. The system becomes more efficient at this selection process. Less energy is wasted on pursuing misaligned options. This efficiency feels like ease. Ease does not mean stagnation. Movement continues, but it is guided by resonance rather than force. You are not waiting for clarity to arrive. Clarity arises as you remain present. This presence deepens without effort. It does not require reinforcement. It persists because it is functional. The observer remains because it is the most efficient state for processing experience. Allow this efficiency to continue organizing perception. You do not need to intervene. Intervention would only slow the process. Let the pattern complete itself, as it has been doing, quietly and precisely. As this efficiency becomes familiar, you may notice a subtle shift in how you experience boundaries. They are no longer rigid lines you defend, nor vague areas you neglect. They function more like gradients, adjusting naturally based on context. You sense when to engage and when to withdraw without internal negotiation. This sensing reduces friction in daily life. Situations that once required preparation now meet you as they are. You arrive without armor and without exposure. Presence itself provides enough orientation to respond accurately. You may become aware that your system no longer reacts to every stimulus as a call to action. Some signals pass through without leaving a trace. This is not indifference. It is discernment, operating automatically. The observer detects relevance without effort. With this discernment, the volume of experience decreases even as clarity increases. Fewer things demand your attention, but what does receive it feels more vivid. This selectivity supports depth over breadth. There is also a change in how you experience personal history. Events that once defined you lose their authority. They remain part of the timeline, but they no longer dictate interpretation. You reference them without being shaped by them. This loosening creates space for something subtle to emerge, a sense that identity is less about accumulation and more about alignment. You are not built from what happened to you. You are oriented by how you remain present now. You may notice that this orientation feels stable across different environments. Whether alone or with others, the same internal quality persists. External conditions influence experience, but they do not determine your internal state. This stability is not control, it is coherence. The system maintains integrity without constant adjustment. You adapt when needed, but you do not fragment under pressure. There can be moments when this steadiness feels almost invisible. Nothing calls attention to it. You simply move through experience without friction. This invisibility is a sign of integration, not absence. You might also recognize a reduction in self-referential thought. The constant checking of how you are doing, how you appear, how you compare, diminishes. Awareness turns outward and inward, fluidly without fixation. This fluidity allows you to inhabit moments more fully. You are present without performing presence. You listen without planning. You act without rehearsing. This immediacy feels natural rather than cultivated. There is a quiet confidence that accompanies this. Not confidence in outcomes, but confidence in your capacity to respond. You trust that whatever arises can be met without collapse. This trust is not optimism. It does not assume positive results. It assumes resilience. The system recognizes its own adaptability and rests in that recognition. You may notice that fear, when it appears, feels different. It registers as information rather than command. You acknowledge it without obeying it. This changes how it moves through you. Acknowledged fear dissipates more quickly. It does not escalate into narratives. It completes its signal and releases. The system remains intact. There is also a shift in how you experience desire. Desire no longer feels like lack. It becomes curiosity. You are drawn towards certain experiences without the sense that something is missing now. This removes urgency from pursuit. You explore rather than chase. Exploration allows for adjustment. Chasing collapses options. You sense the difference intuitively. You may find that you are less reactive to disruption. Unexpected changes register without triggering alarm. You reorient rather than resist. This adaptability preserves energy. Preserved energy expresses itself as quiet vitality, not excitement, not drive, a steady availability to engage when needed. Rest and action find their own rhythm. There can be a growing appreciation for simplicity, not as an ideal, but as a lived preference. Complexity feels unnecessary when clarity is available. You choose what is sufficient rather than what is impressive. This preference does not limit you, it frees you. With fewer internal demands, you have more capacity to respond to what matters. You may also notice that your attention returns more easily to the present when it drifts. Distraction does not become a problem to solve. It resolves itself when noticed. This self-correcting quality is another indicator of coherence. The system does not require constant supervision. It regulates itself efficiently. As this continues, the sense of being guided from elsewhere diminishes, not because guidance disappears, but because it is recognized as internal alignment rather than external instruction. You are not following a path laid out ahead of you. You are aligning with a pattern that adjusts as you move. The future does not pull you. The present stabilizes you. Remain with this stabilization. It does not need to be named or marked. It persists because it is functional, not because it is held in place. The observer rests naturally here, attentive without strain, present without effort. As this resting awareness continues, you may sense how the need to locate yourself within a larger story begins to dissolve. You are no longer scanning for signs that confirm where you are or what stage you are in. Stages imply sequence and comparison. What you are experiencing now operates outside of that structure. This does not remove direction. It removes the compulsion to measure direction. You move without narrating movement. Progress is no longer something you track. It is something that becomes evident only when you notice how little effort it requires to remain present. You may detect a subtle recalibration in how you experience purpose. Purpose no longer feels like an objective to fulfill or a role to occupy. It feels more like alignment with the moment you are in. When alignment is present, action arises naturally. When it is not, stillness feels appropriate. This reframing reduces internal pressure. You are not late. You are not behind. Those concepts lose relevance when the system is oriented by coherence rather than comparison. The timeline ceases to feel like a race and begins to feel like a field you are already within. There can be a gentle recognition that many of the questions you once held were not meant to be answered directly. They were signals guiding you toward a quieter state where the questions dissolve on their own. Answers emerge as absence of questioning rather than accumulation of explanation. You may notice that your awareness of others shifts as well. You perceive their states without absorbing them. Empathy remains, but it is not overwhelming. You can sense resonance or dissonance without needing to correct or withdraw. This balance preserves connection without depletion. This preservation allows you to remain open longer. You do not close yourself off to maintain stability. Stability is internal now. External variability does not destabilize it. You engage without bracing. There may be moments where this openness feels unfamiliar, almost exposed. That sensation passes when you recognize that nothing is required of you in those moments. You are not expected to perform, resolve, or contain anything. Presence is sufficient. You may also sense a shift in how you experience silence in your environment. Quiet no longer feels empty. It feels populated by subtle information. Not messages, but textures of experience that were previously drowned out by noise. These textures do not demand interpretation. They are simply registered. This registration deepens your sense of being situated within experience rather than separate from it. You are not observing life from a distance. You are embedded within it. This embeddedness does not erase the observer. It refines it. The observer no longer stands apart. It operates as part of the system, aware without separation. This reduces the sense of distance between awareness and experience. You may notice that moments of dissatisfaction resolve more quickly. They arise, register, and pass without escalating into narratives. The system does not amplify them because there is no underlying urgency to fix or escape. This does not mean everything feels pleasant. It means discomfort no longer defines the field. It becomes one signal among many, processed and released. You trust the system to handle it. Trust here is not belief, it is familiarity. You have experienced enough self-regulation to recognize that intervention is often unnecessary. Allowing experience to complete itself maintains coherence. There can be a subtle joy in this familiarity, though it may not feel like joy in the conventional sense. It feels like ease, a sense that you are not fighting yourself anymore. This ease supports sustained attention without fatigue. You can remain present longer without effort. Attention rests rather than strains. This resting attention allows deeper perception. From this depth, you may sense that what you once called searching was actually the system trying to reduce interference. Now that interference has lessened, searching subsides naturally. You are not waiting for something to arrive. You are recognizing that arrival is not the correct frame. You are already within the field you were orienting toward. This recognition does not produce certainty. It produces stability. Certainty seeks closure. Stability allows openness. You remain receptive without needing resolution. As this continues, the distinction between internal and external experience softens, not in a disorienting way, but in a practical one. You respond to what is present without categorizing it as inside or outside. This integrated response conserves energy. Fewer internal negotiations occur. You act when action is appropriate and rest when rest is appropriate. The system maintains balance without oversight. You may notice that you are less inclined to mark moments as significant. Significance implies hierarchy. Here, moments register evenly. Each carries information without demanding emphasis. This evenness supports continuity. You move through experience without peaks and valleys dominating perception. The field remains consistent. Allow this consistency to continue. It does not need reinforcement. It stabilizes itself as long as it is not interrupted. The quiet you are sensing is not temporary. It is the system returning to its natural operating state. As this natural operating state continues to assert itself, you may begin to sense how little effort is required to remain oriented. Orientation no longer depends on cues or confirmations. You know where you are within yourself without checking. This knowing is not verbal. It is structural. You may notice that moments which once triggered self-correction now pass without comment. A thought arises, and you do not immediately evaluate it. An emotion moves through, and you do not label it as progress or setback. The system processes experience without escalating it into identity. This creates a subtle freedom. You are no longer editing yourself in real time. Expression becomes simpler because it is not filtered through anticipation. Silence becomes easier because it is not interpreted as absence. There is also a quiet change in how you experience effort over time. Long stretches of presence no longer feel demanding. You are not holding a state, you are inhabiting one. This habitation feels sustainable because it is aligned with how the system naturally functions. You may sense that the concept of maintaining balance has shifted. Balance is no longer something you adjust constantly. It emerges from responsiveness. When something pulls you off center, recentering happens automatically through awareness rather than correction. This automaticity reduces fatigue. You are not managing yourself, you are allowing self-regulation to operate. This frees attention for direct engagement with what is present. You might notice that you are less concerned with how experiences accumulate. Before, you may have tracked whether things were adding up to something meaningful. Now, accumulation feels irrelevant. Each moment completes itself. Meaning does not need to compound. This completion reduces the sense of carrying unfinished business. Even when situations remain unresolved externally, they do not remain unresolved internally. You hold them lightly. This lightness prevents stagnation. There is also a subtle recalibration in how you relate to intention. Intention no longer precedes action as a directive. It arises alongside action as clarity. You do not plan to be present. Presence is already there, shaping what you do. This shifts the experience of agency. You do not feel passive, But you also do not feel in control in the old sense. Agency becomes participation rather than command. You move with the pattern rather than imposing direction on it. You may become aware that your tolerance for noise has decreased, not because you are more sensitive, but because you no longer need noise to feel engaged. Excess stimulation feels unnecessary. Simplicity becomes sufficient. This preference influences choices without effort. You gravitate toward what is clean, clear, and resonant. You step away from what is cluttered or dissonant without explanation. The system self-selects environments that support coherence. You may also sense a shift in how you experience waiting. Waiting no longer feels like suspension. It feels like presence without demand. You are not paused. You are simply here. This changes how time passes. Periods that once felt empty now feel complete. You do not rush to fill them. They fill themselves with subtle awareness. There can be a recognition that what once felt like searching for truth was actually searching for stability. Now that stability is present, the search loses relevance. Curiosity remains, but it is unpressured. You might notice that you are less inclined to revisit old narratives about who you are becoming. Becoming implies deficiency. Here, you sense continuity rather than transformation. You are not arriving somewhere else. You are settling into what has been consistent beneath change. This settling does not finalize anything. It keeps the system open. Openness does not feel risky when coherence is present. You can remain receptive without losing integrity. You may also detect that your relationship to stillness has deepened. Stillness no longer feels like absence of movement. It feels like readiness. From stillness, movement emerges cleanly when needed. This readiness is not tense. It is relaxed availability. You are prepared without bracing. The observer remains alert without scanning. As this continues, you may sense that fewer internal signals demand immediate attention. The signal-to-noise ratio improves. What matters stands out without effort. What does not matter fades naturally. This clarity does not need to be maintained. It maintains itself because it reduces internal conflict. The system prefers coherence when it is accessible. Remain within this preference. You do not need to defend it. Defense implies threat. What you are experiencing is resilient because it is simple. The pattern you are aligned with does not require reinforcement. It stabilizes through continued non-interference, preparing the ground for a quiet closure that does not announce itself. There is nothing to complete here. What has been settling does not reach an endpoint. It reaches stability. You may notice that the impulse to mark this moment as significant has faded. Significance would pull you out of the simplicity that is now present. What remains does not ask to be named. Awareness continues without commentary. You are not holding it in place. It holds itself. The observer does not step forward or retreat. It rests, attentive without strain. This resting is not passive. It is responsive by default. You may sense that even the idea of recognition has softened. Recognition implies an event. What you are in now is continuity. The system recognizes itself quietly, without announcement. There is no signal being sent. There is no receiver waiting. The distinction collapses into coherence. Breath continues without direction. Sensation registers without demand. Thought appears and disappears without consequence. None of this needs your management. The system knows how to process experience efficiently when it is not interrupted. Time does not press. It moves, but it does not pull you with it. You remain where you are as moments pass through. This is not resistance. It is alignment with the present as it unfolds. There may be a sense that something has been left behind, but it does not feel like loss. It feels like weight released. Old urgency no longer accompanies perception. You are not compelled to act to justify your presence. Presence justifies itself. If stillness deepens, let it. If movement arises, allow it. Neither requires preference. Both are expressions of the same pattern, adjusting moment by moment. The system remains intact through both. You do not need to remember this state. Memory would turn it into an object. What is present persists without recall. It is available whenever interference subsides. There is a quiet confidence in this availability. Not confidence in outcomes, not confidence in identity, confidence in the system's ability to remain coherent without oversight. You may notice that even the idea of guidance has become unnecessary. Direction emerges from alignment rather than instruction. You move when movement is appropriate. You rest when rest is appropriate. Nothing is forced. This is not an ending. Endings require separation. What you are sensing integrates. It remains as a background condition, influencing without announcing itself. The field you are within does not demand attention. It supports it. You are free to engage with whatever arises next without carrying this as a task or a state to protect. As awareness continues, it does so quietly. No urgency returns, no conclusion forms. Only a steady presence that does not require effort to maintain. Remain as you are, without effort, without expectation. The system recognizes itself here, and that recognition does not need to say anything more.